one of the first tasks I get asked to do is, can you put together a word list for these 3 books? And being a good freelancer, I said, yes, of course I can do that, lovely. Put the phone down, where do I start? Now, after I got over my initial panic, I started thinking about, okay, so what's the logical way of going about doing this? And my talk today is really how that process worked, how we chose the vocabulary that we were going to include, and then how we graded it, because I'd already been told that they wanted to have 3 books at different levels. So I had to think about not just selecting vocabulary, but then grading it according to level. So, 2 tasks. First of all, selecting the vocabulary, and then grading it by level. Now, the first obvious starting point when you're thinking about academic vocabulary nowadays is to use the academic word list. I'll explain a little bit more about it, but that is generally seen as a really good starting point for thinking about what academic vocabulary students need to learn. But as the process went on, we realised that perhaps we needed to include some non-AWL vocabulary in our books as well. And I'll explain why we did this and how we chose that vocabulary. The next stage was splitting by levels. Now, we'd already decided on 3 levels. Well, why? I think it's because EAP generally, and IELTS as well, isn't a solid single level. It's not like preparing something for a first certificate exam. You don't have a set of students who are all more or less at the same level. As you're probably aware, IELTS is graded, students get a score from 1 to 9 theoretically, but usually somewhere in the middle there. So what it's testing is not that they've reached a single level, but it's seeing at what level of competency they are. So we decided that we needed to think about those beginner students at the bottom who are just coming into a new IELTS class, the solid ones in the middle and the more advanced ones. So that's why we decided to split over more than 1 level. So a little bit of background to the academic word list, seeing as this was at my initial starting point. It was developed by Avril Coxhead, who's based in New Zealand in around about 2000. And it's based on a corpus of academic texts. So largely journal articles, textbooks, all the kind of texts that students come across in their studies. They collected this corpus together, and they found which were the most frequently occurring words within that corpus. So what vocabulary is common in academic writing. But then they made a couple of decisions. They excluded roughly the top 2,000 most common words. So obviously you don't want words like the, an, at, on, that are just generally common through the language. So they took those words out. So they weren't looking at frequency of just very common words. Then at the other end, they didn't want to include very subject-specific words. What they were looking for was a list of words that were common across a range of different disciplines. So words that only occurred in 1 or 2 subject areas, particularly sciencey words or whatever, they excluded as well. So what they ended up with was 570 head words, which were common academic vocabulary that is used across disciplines. Now, those 570 head words, behind them, if you like, are divided into word families. So you might have create, but then creation, creator, creative, and those are all grouped together under that one head word. So it comes up to something like 5,000 individual items altogether when you look at the whole lot. Then when I started looking at the language, I thought, well, is this enough for a student who wants to study for IELTS when I'm looking at that big wide range of different students? And I started to realise that there's stuff missing. Particularly if you start off by thinking of those students at the lower end who are just in their first IELTS class, the assumption that they already know that top 2,000 words would be nice. It'd be lovely to have students who came to us with a perfect mastery already of general English, but as we all know, they haven't. They may be familiar with most of them, but they certainly aren't able to use them effectively, productively in different situations. So the first set of vocabulary that we thought about was some of those, perhaps the top end of that 2,000 most common words. We realised some of these, for the lower students, aren't yet known, so they are words we need to focus on. We then have an issue to do with corpus frequency. Anybody who's ever done any corpus research is aware that when you're looking at frequencies of words, you are looking at the whole word. And in English, many words, as we know, are polysemous. They have many meanings. So you look in a dictionary and there'll be lots of senses for a word. Whereas the general frequency we look at is for all of them together. But often, some of the less common senses actually are lower frequency. So to give you an example, a word like table. Very basic word, very common, probably one of the words you learn in one of your first English classes, table and chair. But in an academic context, a table is something different, or can be. It's a visual representation of data in rows and columns on the page. So obviously this sense of table is not so common. So we were thinking not just at a very general level, but thinking about the individual senses of words. And we decided we weren't going to come up with a comprehensive dictionary because that's what dictionaries do. We wanted to focus on the senses of words that students need when they're writing academic essays. So a word like table, although it's apparently common, got bumped up to being less common. We then thought about the actual exam. Now, the academic word list is lovely, but it's a bit boring. It's a bit bland. The very fact that subject-specific vocabulary has been excluded means that it's actually quite difficult to talk about any real topic just using AWL vocabulary. We need the words that are a little bit more specific. So we looked at past papers. We looked at what are common IELTS topics. So things like transport and pollution and society and culture and all those topics that come up. And we gathered together some vocabulary sets connected to those topics. Now, sometimes they were already on the AWL, but sometimes they were new. We also specifically looked at actual tasks. So the data commentary task, the task 1 writing task, where students are asked to describe statistics and graphs and things like this. We wanted to make sure that that vocabulary was included. So we've got a lot of vocabulary to do with numbers, statistics, trends, all those things that students at IELTS really need to know. So we added that to the mix. We also, once I'd got onto this train of thinking, I thought, oh, are there other areas missing here? So I started thinking about some of the key academic concepts, so cause and effect, time and sequence, describing quantity, all these general academic concepts that are so key in essays, problem solution, these kind of things. And again, came up with some vocabulary there, some of which was already AWL, but some of which wasn't. And finally, we wanted to cater for students across levels, but also across disciplines. Students approaching an IELTS exam, they might be computer scientists, they might be historians, they could be all sorts. And we wanted to include a little bit of what I've described as syllabus vocabulary. Now, we didn't want to go into very, very specialised vocabulary here, but I was thinking at kind of A level. So the kind of language that a general educated person might know. So we had 3 levels. Level 1, which we've called starter, 2, improver, and 3, advanced. And how are these going to split up? Well, we used the IELTS scores. So level 1 are those beginner students just coming in, who you might consider to be kind of IELTS 4 to 5.5. So they're kind of just getting onto the scale. And And for these students, what they're wanting to do is move from general English into writing a basic essay. So a kind of high school style essay. They're not quite solid IELTS yet, but they're starting to develop those skills. So that was our first level. The second level, if you like, is the good solid IELTS scores, the 5.5 to 6.5 kind of range. So 6.5 might be the kind of score that many students need to enter a university course. So this is where we're focusing on a really good, competent IELTS essay that's going to move them on to the next level. Then the final level, we've classified as IELTS 7+. So there's kind of two groups of students in mind here. These are either the students who need a higher IELTS score, who are perhaps going to study law or medicine or one of those kind of subjects that demand a high score. It also caters for kind of a post-IELTS student. So they've already got their score and they're moving on. That's why I said we're blurring the lines between IELTS and EAP. So to divide up our vocabulary, we used frequency as our main starting point. And we had two sources. Some of you may know that the academic word list is broken down into sublists. And these are numbered 1 to 10. The words on sublist 1 are the words which are most frequent within that academic corpus. So the sublist 1 words occur a lot in academic genres, and then down to 10, which are slightly less frequent at the bottom end of what they decided to include. So I was using that as one measure, but this is the measure of what the students want to achieve. I also wanted to consider, but what do they already know? Where are they coming from? So I also wanted to look at frequency in the language as a whole, in general English, to see what words students might already be quite confident with, because they'd already learned them on their general English courses, and what are likely to be new in that sense. So to do this, I used the Collins-Coburn frequency banding. Now, this actually has 6 levels of banding. The dictionary actually only shows the top 3 frequency bands, the top 3 most common bands. So the very most frequent words have 3 diamonds, down to the least frequent, which have no stars in the dictionary, no diamonds in the dictionary, are ranked 0, 1, 2, or 3. So I've got these 2 scores to balance up to start me going on this task of dividing up the vocabulary. Now, at the beginning, there were some nice easy cases. So if you have a look at these top 3 words here, we have research, available, and environment. All of these appear on sublist 1, so they're all frequent in academic English, and they have high frequency bandings in general English. Now, intuitively, we think, yes, that makes sense. These are sort of good, solid words that students who are beginning on IELTS will be a little bit familiar with, but we might want to move on their knowledge and their productive ability with. So these are good candidates for book 1. Then at the other end of the scale, we have analogy, paradigm, intrinsic. These have much higher AWL sublist numbers. So we've got 9, 7, and 10 here. So they're less frequent in academic English, and unsurprisingly, they're right down the bottom in terms of general English as well. I started coming across problem words, issues and anomalies. And often, the same as in any area of research, these are actually the most interesting parts. So what I'm going to share with you is some of those issues that I came across in trying to place the words, and be interesting to see if you've come across similar things. Now, one of the first issues I came up against was this issue of word families. Now, if you've looked at the AWL, word families, it has a head word, base form of the word. But then they also show the most frequent word in italics. So for this word family, economy is the head word, but economic is the most frequently used form in their corpus. And sure enough, those 2 are also high frequency in the language. So that's good. Economy, economic, yep, they look like good candidates for book 1. But then you look down the other members of the word family, and they're clearly much less frequent. So economical, yeah, economics and economist are still ranked 3, so they're kind of in the middle. But when you get to economical, economically uneconomical, these are much less frequent. So then we have the dilemma. Do we put all of these words together in book 1? Now, there is obviously an argument for teaching word families together. But if I've got a beginner IELTS student, do I want to throw all this lot at them? It's just going to add to confusion. So what we decided to do was actually to split the word families. So the entry for level 1, we just included those 2 most common ones, economy and economic. And we give, as you can see, the way we've organised it, it's kind of like a dictionary entry, but with a bit more information. So we've got the definition and the examples, but then plenty of collocations. So we want the students to get familiar with these basic forms first. And then we go on to the higher level. This is the level 2 entry, which has been expanded out. What we've done here is we've repeated economy and economic. You will notice actually we have less information in economy this time, and we've expanded out. Because once you get to this level 2 stage, the students are then really thinking about paraphrasing, varying the way they speak about things. So this is the point at which they need to start having more control of those word families. Yeah? And we also have things like usage notes, so difference between economic and economical, because this is the stage where students are going, oh, but I know there's this other word, and they start confusing it. Obviously, this is the entry for economy. The other word on the list that isn't included is uneconomical. Now, we had to make a decision whether we were going to include that or not, because it was really low down on frequency. And in fact, we didn't give it its own entry, but it does appear as an antonym of economical. So it's in there, but it didn't quite merit its own entry. At the end of the talk, you will get a handout which has examples that I use through my talk in a more readable form. So one of the issues we had was these splitting up of word families, deciding which words to teach at which level. Other issues that we came across, one was where there was a big discrepancy between the general frequency and the academic frequency of a word. So a couple of examples that came up were the words colleague and team were both classified as very at the infrequent end on the academic word list. They are academic words, but they're not as common. But obviously, they're quite high frequency generally. They're words that many students would be familiar with already. So it's silly just because they're low frequency on the academic word list to put them in the high-level book. So sometimes we had to think about where are we going to put this language. And as a teacher, you realise, well, if students already are familiar with these words, they're academic words, start them off at the beginning, get them using them. So sometimes there were discrepancies there. Also, as I said, we were focusing on senses. Remember, I was talking about table. Sometimes there were 2 relevant academic senses, but they worked out differently in terms of their frequencies. So a word like conduct. There are 2 possible academic senses that I've picked out. One meaning carry out, so conduct research, conduct a survey. That's quite a solid general usage that we've put in at level 2. But then we have the more specific usage, the scientific one, to conduct electricity, which is a more sciencey word, that we moved to level 3. So rather than trying to teach them all together, we thought about at what level are the students likely to use this sense of the word. We also had some issues with some of the semantic sets we came across. Sometimes words that intuitively you felt should be taught together actually came out with different frequencies. So advantage and disadvantage. Advantage is much higher frequency in the language than disadvantage is. for all kinds of reasons, phrases it's used in, etc. But if you're teaching students to write an advantages and disadvantages essay, you want these two words together. So again, we had to override the frequency information a little bit, use our intuition, and put both of these at level 1. Well, my conclusion after going through my phase of critical thinking came out something like this. So the starter level, we had 789 entries altogether, and of those, 112 were AWL words. So that's only 14% of the level 1 book is academic word list. Because, as I said before, often students who are coming into IELTS, there's a lot of that basic vocabulary they still need to get right. And they're just starting to move into the genre, into the proper solid academic vocabulary. Level 2, we had 800 entries, of which 330 were AWL. So here, nearly almost half of the words are academic word list words, which is unsurprising. So students who are really getting into writing academic essays, they're really starting to use the register, so that's where they need the bulk of these words. And then the advanced level, we had 704 entries, of which 180 were AWL. So again, a sizable chunk, 26%, but less because we were then going into the subject vocabulary, the slightly more interesting areas, if you like, for those students who are thinking of moving past IELTS, who don't want to write essays about pollution anymore, who want to talk about real things in subjects they're interested in. So this is how we went about breaking down that monolithic academic word list, including different ideas, to come up with something that hopefully is useful for students as they work their way through to becoming proficient EAP users. And what we ended up with was a series of 3 books. I'm not saying that this is the end point. I used one set of data, the AWL and the co-build. I filtered it through certain criteria to come up with a set of words that are useful. But then as a teacher and as a student, you're going to filter that again. You know, you can't say, oh, I'll take this book, learn all the words, and I'll pass IELTS. You use your own criteria for what you already know, what you're interested in, but hopefully it'll be a useful guide. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody.